Willkommen in einem video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case part 53 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case, I'll be providing a rather disorganised Christmas special, which started with a particular objective and ended up with a surprising conclusion, which I'm sure all figure gamers battle with. Because of changing work situations, I've lacked the time to keep up with my normal video output, which I'm rather sad about. However, I intend to complete my work career by the following Christmas, and my current project is to pick up enough cash to buy everything I need to keep me occupied for several years, specifically painting figures and preparing force mixes when I've retired. My plan is that each month, while I'm still employed, I will order the figures to build out a specific force mix. Once I receive the figures, I then pack them away, waiting for free time, or the free time, to paint and base the figures after I've stopped working. One aspect that always puzzles me is I actually possess more than enough figures to keep me occupied for many years in terms of gaming. However, I've discovered I need to create new force mixes to keep me occupied when I'm not gaming, or in summary, gaming is not enough. In terms of what I currently possess, my very first force mix was a 1:285 scale or 6mm German force mix. This has grown to the point where there is no way I would ever be able to field this entire thing in a game. I currently estimate I have about 420 vehicle elements and about 200 infantry elements of German late war figures, and also I possess 300 early war German vehicle elements. My German force mix is so ludicrously large I began to split them up by period. This is one of my split-off force mixes, a late war force mix, specifically for the Eastern Front. This shows my early war force mix as I gained a little bit of interest in the early period of World War II, 39 up to 41. While my primary focus was collecting German World War II figures, I quickly discovered I needed more than one side, particularly if I wanted new players. As my main interest is Ostfront, I also possessed now an equally large Soviet force mix for World War II, about 420 Soviet figure elements and 200 Russian infantry elements, primarily mid to late war. While gaining a second force mix, Soviet, did assist me in getting new players, I quickly discovered that many gamers preferred playing Western Allied force mixes. So I went out and purchased a US late war force mix. Not particularly large, but large enough to satisfy any kind of game requirement I could possibly imagine. This is about 200 figures with about 100 infantry elements of World War II US forces in total. I also possess a much smaller UK force mix, perhaps about 100 figures, but it doesn't possess infantry. However, I generally mix the two, US and UK, and can generally put together whatever I need for a particular player if they prefer UK or US. One thing I discovered in the rules that I typically use, which is a battalion scale, that is, each element's a battalion, there are not many tanks on the playing area, and you mainly need infantry and artillery, which I have a lot of. Because I had such a large German force mix, which included early tanks, I created a German early war force mix. Well, I also needed some opponents, so I possess a 100-figure Polish force mix. In addition, I also possess about 150 1940 French figures as well. This rounds off my World War II forces. One area which I initially neglected, but later when I started playing rules like LWRS and Neuschwerpunkt, which require air support, I started purchasing aircraft. And I actually enjoyed whipping up all these different aircraft, particularly the ludicrously modern jet bomber in the bottom right corner. Obviously, I also needed to build out a Western Allied force mix, so I've got Soviet, primarily Soviet and American, and a few British. I must admit I did go a little bit overboard with 4-engined Soviet bombers, which I've yet to ever use in any game I've ever played, but I think they look cool regardless. Possibly equally as early as my first German 6mm force mix, I also tried World War II naval. But I mainly purchased carriers, in this case US carriers, and there is a distinct lack of carrier figure gaming rules, which achieves the figure gamer's bling objective. So this pretty much went down the wayside or back burner. I am, however, thinking currently of trying a World War One naval force mix at this scale, as I think for figures you're better off trying to reproduce non-carrier warfare and good old-fashioned gun-based naval warfare. You may have noticed a lot of empty slots in my previous boxes of figures. I can assure you, every spot has a figure that should go in it. But my collection is so ludicrously large, to make it portable, I had to create special storage boxes for force mixtures, which I was only using for a specific day game. This shows my 1944 Soviet force mix for a typical game that I would have played at the club. Consists of a couple of armoured corps or tank corps and a few infantry divisions. While my first love was always World War II, my local club went down the Cold War path. I suspect because of a new edition of WRG rules that came out which covered this period, so everyone thought they were pretty good. And they were kind of okay. As a result, I ended up with an equally ludicrously large NATO and Soviet force mix. My main Cold War force mix was West German, and I possess about 300 vehicles and 100 infantry elements of this force mix. As NATO also uses the same camouflage between different nationalities, I also picked up about 100 US and 50 UK vehicles as well, and I can generally field most force mixes as long as they're UK, US or West German only. I don't possess any French. I started going down the French path, but I never actually went beyond a couple of APC, packets of APCs that is. However, as I've rapidly discovered as I went into this hobby, if you want to get new players, you need opposing forces. So I picked up a Soviet force mix. My Soviet force mix consists of about 400 vehicles, 200 infantry elements, and is in many ways larger than my West German force mix, which I found quite surprising. I will never be able to use all these figures, and I have no idea why I purchased so many, but I've discovered figure gaming is like a drug, and I was clearly hooked. This video is not really focusing on the rules, but in terms of rules, I've used so many different sets of rules, it's difficult to keep up with them all. These days, I mainly use a figure game conversion of a set of SPI rules, modern battles, which I call Neuschöpfung. It's simple, gives me a game to completion in 3 hours with a clear winner and loser, and which new players tend to like. However, prior to this, I've used WRG World War II, WRG Modern War or Cold War rules, Corps Commander, Challenger, FFT3, Panzer Corps, LWRS and Spearhead. Spearhead seems to be the rules with the most traction these days, but I do prefer Panzer Corps as it's reasonably popular and surprisingly enough a free set of rules, homegrown set of rules, LWRS is also a rather popular pick as long as you can build a good scenario. Apart from 6mm World War II and Cold War figures, I also went down the Napoleonic rat hole, so to speak, something I really never expected doing, but my main opponent or gaming buddy loved Napoleonics, particularly French. Initially, I built up a large Prussian force mix. I estimate I possess about 500 elements of Prussian infantry, cavalry and artillery. The number of figures are ludicrously large, so I've broken up my Prussian force mix into different rules or basing force mixes. I have a DBN force mix, and in the future I'll be creating a Napoleon's battle force mix using their particular unique basing system. I really did build up an absurdly large Prussian force mix, particularly a large or absurdly large artillery force, mainly because WRG tended to give you a big advantage if you can get enough artillery pieces on the playing area in a game, which is why I went down that path. Not a good reason to do it, but I was interested in winning games, and my opponent, being French, decided to go down the cavalry path. When I built up my Prussian force mix and used it quite a bit, we tended to get into a stalemate because of the rules. I was using WRG, I was putting too many figures on the playing area and the games weren't going anywhere, so it kind of went on the back burner for many years. But then I discovered Napoleon's battles, and a figure game conversion of an SPI board game, Napoleon's War, which I call Großschlachten, or Big Battles. This has exploded because my local club tends to mainly play Napoleonics, and these rules tended to fit in quite well with the local gamers there. The board game conversion has been very popular, again, mainly because it's really simple to learn and can give me a game with an actual end within a 3 to 4 hour period. So I could go to the club, and if someone basically had an IQ that was higher than the current temperature, they could pick up the rules in about 5 minutes and actually enjoy them. This created a second wave of Napoleonic interest, and in this second wave I finally decided to build out an Austrian force mix. Often why I never originally picked the Austrians rather than Prussians, as this is actually my ancestral homeland. Nonetheless, what is my Austrian force mix was built up very carefully, as I did not wish to over-purchase figures. In my second round of Napoleonics, I'd learnt the lesson from my first round, and the main lesson is work out exactly what you need for the set of rules that you're using, and don't try and overbuy figures. I possess about 150 elements, which is more than enough for any of the games that I would need to play, typically. As is my practice, or the practice that I've learned, in order to gain opponents, I then built out a French force mix. Again, about 150 elements. As it turned out, I normally had to play with these figures, the French, as most of my opponents tended to prefer other nationalities, British, Prussian and Austrian, which I found rather unusual. To give me yet more opponents, I then decided to build out a British force mix, using old figures I'd purchased many years ago. Actually, I decided to build out the British force mix simply because I had these old figures which I'd purchased 20 years ago, and I decided that I might as well paint them up. There's only about 120 elements in strength in this particular force mix, and I probably need to consider to fill out parts of it, but it ended up being adequate, and anything that was a gap, such as, Allies, Portuguese, etc., I just use one of my other nationality force mixes to fill it in. The only issue I have here is the only cavalry I purchased from memory were light dragoons, so I have a lack of any other kind of cavalry, and that's probably what I'll need to fill out in the future: heavy dragoons, cuirassiers, etc., etc. While I wasn't going overboard with any individual force mix, I was still hooked on figure gaming in terms of painting and buying figures, and I decided to create a Russian force mix. Again, 150 figures. With this force mix, I decided to call it a day, at least when I completed the Russian force mix. I'll be restarting my Napoleonic painting after I retire, as we'll discuss later in this video. Finally, we come to Ancients. This occurred shortly after my Napoleonic phase, when the artillery cavalry drills were using WRG became rather boring. The Napoleonic phase, as a result of this back in the 80s, did not really last long, and the club that I was with quickly moved on to Ancients. I played in a Ancients campaign, which I actually found astoundingly enjoyable. My initial force mix was a 15mm Greek force mix, specifically Athenians. This consisted of about 300 elements. I then decided I wanted a Roman force mix and built up an Imperial Roman army, spanning the early to middle Imperial Roman periods. This also consisted of about 300 elements. I was really on a roll at this time and decided that I wanted to try up a Carthaginian force mix, as the Carthaginians had lots of different types of troop types, and I wanted to see if I can do something interesting with them. This ended up also consisting of 300 elements, but I did lose about 100 to corrosion while I had it stored for about 20 years while I was overseas. However, what is left is more than enough for any game I wish to play. One reason why I went down the Carthaginian path was that I could have elephants, and I had lots and lots of them. This also applied to my Macedonian force mix, although with the Macedonians I didn't purchase as many elephants. I did never actually complete my Macedonian force mix because one of my gaming buddies actually gifted me his Macedonian army, so I stopped collecting or stopped painting Macedonians at that point. One advantage of having a Carthaginian force mix, particularly a very large one, was that I could field a Spanish and Gaelic force mix if I so desired. Because one of my gaming friends, the same person who forced me into Napoleonics, ended up getting a Mongolian army, I decided I better go and get a Teutonic force mix because the Teutons did fight the Mongols, at least for one battles. Unfortunately, I went completely overboard with this force mix. I ended up with about 350 elements, and it probably represented a force mix larger than any actual Teutonic force mix ever could exist in history. In the same way that with my Carthaginians, I discovered that building out an enormous Teutonic force mix allowed me to also field Polish and early Prussian force mixes or armies as well, particularly if it's only 200-point DBMM armies. One of my gaming friends gifted me his Macedonian force mix, which was a reasonable 150 figures in size, elements in size. The figures are very nice, well painted, but I never really used them or even liked it very much. And I suspect the main reason was that I didn't paint them, and as a result I didn't have so much affinity with it. I know it's rather silly, but that's the way it is. My buddy my friend gave me his force mix because he had decided that he was no longer going to game. During the naval phase, particularly around the campaign, my club went down the ancient naval warfare route as well, and I built up two large naval force mixes, early Greek and Roman. This did die out reasonably quickly, but I may yet try this in the future. However, I'll probably repaint them and create much better bases than you can see here. One of my last projects before my work situation changed was a 6mm Napoleonic force mix. However, I only managed to build out a 6mm French force mix only. This is about 150 to 200 elements in size. After my 6mm Napoleonic force mix was finished off, my work situation changed and I stopped painting and even gaming figures because of a lack of time. My collection was more than enough to allow me to refight any ancient Napoleonic World War II or Cold War figure game in the future. So in many ways, I was thinking that I never needed to purchase any more figures, and once my work situation or once I retired, I could go back to gaming with what I had. At least that was the initial thought. However, considering it for a while, I realised that this was never going to fly. It was an error. While I had force mixes for lots and lots of different games, more than enough that I would never need in theory to ever purchase any more force mixes, I needed new projects to keep me occupied in between games. This may be the reason why gamers build out such large force mixes. In simple terms, a figure gamer's main drive for pursuing a figure gaming hobby is not just the mental exercise of a game, or even the bling on a playing area. It's the time spent preparing their force mixes and terrain. It's all about the journey, not specifically the destination. In fact, many figure gamers don't even care about the destination, considering the amount that I know that just set up a game, have one or two game turns with no conclusion, and then are satisfied with it. However, I must admit, in my case, I do need a destination, but I also mainly want to focus on the journey. In my case, my specific issue that I need to deal with is retirement. Once I lack an income, it'll be difficult for me to spend much money on my hobby. So in conclusion, I've decided to stockpile figures up for my retirement so I can occupy myself for many years in the future. Thus, I created a stockpile project. My first new project for this, my retirement plan, is to complete my 6mm Napoleonic force mixes. I already have a French force mix, but I need an opponent, and I've decided to get an Austrian one as well. I have no intention of building out any more force mixes in this scale. 2 is sufficient to allow me to try out for 6mm Napoleonics. In my case, I went for the 3cm square base path, as this aligns with most of the simple rules I'm using right now. I can also place 2 bases together to give me a 6cm wide base, which may allow me to try other rules which require this basing structure. But I'm aiming for smaller playing areas rather than larger playing areas, so I think my 3 cm square basis is the correct path to go down. I personally use buckets for my 6mm requirements, with this being my order for my Austrian force mix. I like buckets, they have a great range, but if you order too much stuff, it can take a while before they can actually ship it. After I ordered that and received it, my next project was to base up 2 force mixes using Napoleon Battles basing, or US basing. I want to try those rules, but the main reason, in addition to trying those rules, is that this base size works very well with my figure game conversion of the SPI Napoleon rules, which I typically use for new players. It works so well, I almost abandoned my plan to build out my 6mm Austrian force mix. If I didn't already have a French one, I probably wouldn't have gone down this 6mm Napoleonics path. Currently, one of my regular opponents has a large 15mm Napoleonic Battles based figure collection. He does lack a French force mix, so I need to build that one out as well. For my opposing force mix, I'll rebase part of my Prussian figures to give me a Prussian force mix for that base if I want to introduce new players to this particular basing system with the rules that I'm using. For my second French force mix, I wanted to use a different supplier, so I decided to go with minifigs. This was, the main reason was if I was going to paint up another French force mix, I wanted to try a different range of figures. These are more expensive than my normal range of figures and slightly larger, but I must admit I am looking forward to paint these up and base them. For my third order, I went back to 6mm backers, in this case ancients. In this case, I've decided to order 2 biblical chariot armors, and what you can see here is my order. I do have a very small Greek H&R, or Heroic and Ross 6mm force mix, which I may also build out in the future. So I do like the idea. Now, the rules I use are, once again, a figure game conversion of an SPI board game, in this case Pre-Stag. And the basing system I've decided to use is basically go back to 3 cm wide, 1 cm deep, and I can place 3 of those elements into a movement tray, which seems to fit in with those particular rules. For my fourth order, I wanted an opponent for my Greek 15mm force mix. When I built out ancient forces back in the 80s and 90s, I never thought about building out opponents. I just built out the force mixes that I happen to be gaming in with the campaign. Now that I'm interested in finding opponents, I realise that if I've got a Greek force mix, I better get an opponent. And the opponent I selected was early Persian. Minifigs has the best range for this force mix, which is the reason why I went down the minifig paths in the first place, actually. For my future orders, I'm going to order a early German, Polybian Roman, and fill out any gaps in any of my existing 15mm ancient forces. In this case, I'll be ordering Lancashire 15mm figures, as they are good value. They're cheap, they meet the requirements, and so be it. I haven't ordered these yet, but I will very soon. My next project is something completely different. I always wanted to try 10mm. I never kind of pinned down the 10mm I wanted to go. Initially I wanted to try Napoleonics, but I've got so many Napoleonic figures, 6mm, 15mm fig, it's not going to make sense. So I decided in this case for my 10mm project to go down the American Civil War fourth path. I'm going to pick up a Union force mix as shown here in the Confederate. I'm going to use again a figure game conversion of the SPI blue and grey board game rules for this, and I will most likely use 3 cm square bases, or perhaps Napoleon's battle basing, which is really where Napoleon battles basing began in the US. There are quite a few rules in the US which use the 1 inch wide, or sorry, 3/4 inch wide, 1 inch deep, or 2 cm wide, 3 cm deep for my part of the world basing, and this works quite well with figure game conversions of board games. Anyway, I've yet to make a decision on exactly the basing system that I wish to use. I do. I haven't planned anything beyond this, but I am sure that I have a few more projects to consider, and I will certainly be doing gap filling orders. But what I've already ordered and stockpiled, I hope will keep me occupied for many years in my retirement. When you decide to retire, it's critical you have a hobby which keeps you active. I have my hobby, and I can heartily recommend this hobby to anyone. And so we come to an end of my part 53 of my figure gaming hobby series of videos. In this case, answering the eternal question every figure gamer faces: have I purchased enough figures? The answer is you will never purchase enough figures. And my dream is when I pass away, I'll be clutching ferociously a paintbrush in my painting desk. Alle guten Dingen kommen zu einem Ende.